Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will attempt to explain and offer solutions to the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 15. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter. And each of these issues affects how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 15, the top 3 issues are the meaning of verse 3c, the meaning of verse 4c, and the meaning of verse 1. What does it mean to dwell in the Lord's dwelling? The first issue is in the last line of verse 3, which we have translated, and has not uttered a taunt against his relative. The Hebrew text reads, V'cherpa lo nasa al krovo. The grammar of this clause is fairly straightforward. The verb is nasa, the direct object is cherpa, and the prepositional phrase al krovo modifies the clause, as does the negative particle lo. And each word in this clause is fairly common. The verb nasa means literally to lift up or to carry something. The direct object, cherpa, can refer to shame or to something that is spoken to bring shame on someone. And the word karov refers to someone with whom you're in close relationship, a neighbor or a relative. So the difficulty isn't so much with understanding the parts in this line, but with understanding what all of these parts mean when they come together in this line and in this context. We agree with the vast majority of translations that interpret this line as being about speech. The KJV, for example, says that he does not take up a reproach against his neighbor. The CSB puts this in more modern English when it says that he does not discredit his neighbor. The NLT uses the phrase, speak evil of their friends. And nearly all modern translations say something along these lines, something having to do with speech. The JPS translation, however, says something different. It says that he has not borne reproach for his acts toward his neighbor. According to most other translations, lifting up shame means bringing shame on another by means of speech. But according to the JPS translation, speech is not involved. And instead, lifting up shame refers to bearing it yourself for something you did to your neighbor. Where does the JPS translation get this idea? Well, elsewhere in the Old Testament, when the verb nasa takes the noun cherpa as a direct object, the phrase always means to bear reproach. So, for example, Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 31:19, Nasati cherpat nuurai, which the ESV translates, I bore the disgrace of my youth. And when the preposition al is added to this construction, as it is in Psalm 15:3, then it means to bear disgrace or reproach for someone's sake. For example, Psalm 69:8 says, Ki alecha nasati cherpa. I have borne disgrace for your sake. So the JPS's interpretation of Psalm 15:3 is consistent with what this combination of words means elsewhere. Yet this consistency makes for a problem in this context. Why would it be a bad thing to bear reproach for the sake of a close friend or a relative? This would seem to be an act of loyalty, and yet the hypothetical character in this psalm is commended for not doing it. The JPS tries to solve this problem by inserting the words borne reproach for his acts toward his neighbor. It's more likely that the line does refer to speech. In the first place, the word cherpa can refer to speech that brings shame or disgrace on someone. For example, Nehemiah 5:9 refers to the taunts of the nations, our enemies. Cherpat hagoyim oivenu. Furthermore, the verb nasa often takes as its object nouns referring to speech. One can lift up nasa, a prayer, a lament, or a message. So while nasa cherpa does usually refer to bearing disgrace or bearing reproach, it's at least possible that it could also mean to utter a taunt or to slander someone. Perhaps the strongest argument for interpreting this line with reference to speech is an argument from the poetic structure. Verse 3 is parallel in a number of ways with the previous verse, verse 2. Both verses describe 3 activities. In verse 2, these activities are positive, and verse 3, they are negative. The first activity in verse 2 is walking with integrity. The first activity in verse 3 is not slandering. And in Hebrew, the word translated slander comes from the word for foot, and so is parallel with the image of walking in verse 2. The second activity in verse 2 is doing what is right. The second activity in verse 3 is not doing harm to a neighbor. The two words for do are synonyms and so form part of the parallel. The third activity in verse 2 is speaking truth sincerely. And if verse 2 and verse 3 are parallel, then we would expect verse 3c to also be about speech. In conclusion, then, we side with the majority of translations that render verse 3c as referring to some kind of speech. The person who is allowed to dwell in the Lord's tent is someone who has not uttered a taunt against his relative. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in the psalm is in the last line of verse 4, which we have translated, "Having sworn so as to harm himself, he will not change." The vast majority of modern translations reflect the same interpretation. The RSV, for example, says, "Who swears to his own hurt and does not change." The NIV says, "Who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind." The oldest translation of this psalm, however, the Old Greek translation, says, "He who swears to his fellow and does not renege." Instead of swearing to his own hurt, he swears to his fellow or to his neighbor. The Syriac Peshitta reflects the same interpretation. He takes an oath with his friend and does not deceive. Why do these older translations say to or with his friend, while most modern translations say something like to his harm? The difference has to do with how the Hebrew text is pronounced. The traditional Hebrew text of verse 4c reads, Nishba l'hara v'lo yamir. The first word, nishba, means he has sworn. The second word, if we follow the vowels of the Masoretic text, is an infinitive construct with a lamed preposition, and it means something like to do harm, l'hara. So together, the first two words, nishba l'hara, means something like he has sworn to do harm. With a slight change in pronunciation, however, the text can be read to mean he has sworn to the neighbor. The word for neighbor is reya. With the definite article, the word is hareya, the neighbor, which sounds similar and looks identical to hara. Apparently, the Septuagint and the Peshitta have pronounced the consonants lamed, he, resh, ayin as l'hareya instead of l'hara. Some scholars have argued that this is the correct pronunciation and that the text talks about swearing to his neighbor instead of to his own harm. But there are some problems with this reading. In the first place, it would be odd to say that he has sworn to the neighbor, l'hareya. We might have expected to his neighbor, l're'ehu, instead, just as we see in the previous verse. Secondly, the form l'hareya is, in and of itself, unusual. Normally, when the definite article occurs together with a prefix preposition, the he sound is elided. So if the text really did say to the neighbor, we would have expected l'areya instead of l'hareya. Now, it's true that there are some exceptional cases when the he is not elided, but these occur mostly in later biblical books. It's more likely, then, that the Masoretic text has preserved the correct pronunciation. Nishba l'hara. He has sworn to harm. But what does it mean to swear to harm? And how is this consistent with the earlier description of this person as one who does no harm to his neighbor? Most translations and commentaries understand swearing to harm as taking an oath that results in harm not to others, but to oneself. The ESV, for example, says, who swears to his own hurt and does not change. The point is that this person is trustworthy, and they can be expected to keep their promises even when it hurts them. As the GNT puts it, they always do what they promise, no matter how much it may cost. We find very similar language in a passage in Leviticus. Leviticus 5:4 says, if anyone thoughtlessly takes an oath to do anything, whether good or evil, and the word translated take an oath is the same as in Psalm 15:4, and the phrase translated here as evil is also the same as in Psalm 15:4, l'hara. We would agree with those scholars who have argued that in the Leviticus passage the reference is probably to an oath that involves not harm to others, but harm to self. In conclusion, then, we read verse 4c according to the traditional pronunciation of the Masoretic text. Nishba l'hara v'lo yamir. And we interpret this, along with most translations, to say, having sworn so as to harm himself, he will not change. We give this interpretation an A rating. The third issue is found in the first verse. The psalm opens with a question, actually a pair of questions. Lord, who may dwell in your dwelling place? Who may stay on your holy mountain? This question frames the whole psalm. Verses 2 to 5 give an answer to this question. How we understand this question, then, will shape how we understand the psalm. For the last 100 years or so, the most popular view has been that dwelling in God's dwelling place, literally dwelling in God's tent, and staying on his holy mountain, refer to worship in the temple. This interpretation is reflected in the Good News Translation, which translates this verse, Lord, who may enter your temple? Who may worship on Zion, your sacred hill? The UBS Handbook on Psalms summarizes this view nicely in the introduction to Psalm 15. It says, this psalm appears to be a liturgical composition to be used by pilgrims as they went to the temple to attend one of the great religious festivals. In verse 1, the pilgrims ask the question about who is allowed to enter the temple, and the answer, given probably by priests, lists the necessary moral qualifications in verses 2 to 5b. In the rest of this video, we'll discuss the arguments for and against this popular view. It's important to note that this view of Psalm 15 assumes from the outset that the Psalms were written for Israel's worship services, or at the very least that the genres of the Psalms grew out of these worship services. If we grant this point and assume that Psalm 15 was designed to function in some way in Israel's worship, it's easy to see how it might have functioned in the way that the UBS Handbook describes. We know that the pre-exilic temple had doorkeepers, Hebrew Shomrei Hasaf, who were presumably priests close in rank to the chief priest. A passage in 2 Kings mentions Sariah the chief priest, Zephaniah the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. We also know that people coming to the temple would sometimes dialogue with the priests. They might ask questions and receive ethical instruction. We read, for example, in Zechariah 7, the people of Bethel had sent Sharezer and Regem-Melech together with their men to entreat the Lord by asking the priests of the house of the Lord Almighty and the prophets, should I mourn and fast in the 5th month, as I have done for so many years? It's possible then that Psalm 15 would have been modeled after, and perhaps even designed for, this kind of encounter at the temple between priest and pilgrim. There are, however, some problems with this popular interpretation. In the first place, it isn't clear that the language of dwelling in the Lord's dwelling, or the Lord's tent, and staying or residing on his holy mountain, is ever used to describe ritual worship in the temple. A close parallel to this language of dwelling in God's tent is in Psalm 61:5, where David says, according to the ESV, let me dwell in your tent forever. Agura v'oholcha. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. Dwelling in God's tent is closely connected here to receiving God's protection. The same is true in Psalm 27, for he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. Even if these passages have the Jerusalem temple in view, they aren't referring to worshiping in the temple, but to living under God's care, just as a guest in the ancient Near East might have lived under the care and protection of his host. A second problem with the popular view is that a priest charged with guarding the temple from those who are unfit to enter would probably not be able to know whether or not someone had kept the requirements listed in the psalm. All of the requirements have to do with ethical behavior, and some have to do with matters of the heart. It's not clear how a priest would be able to decide whether or not someone was fit for entry on the basis of these requirements. A third problem with the popular view is that the temple was a place where people went to confess their sins and offer sacrifices for their sins. The temple, in other words, was for sinners. To have a test at the entrance of the temple which barred entry to anyone who had committed the sins listed in Psalm 15 would be inconsistent with the temple's very purpose. It's unlikely, therefore, that the questions in verse 1 refer to worship in the temple. It's more likely, in light of the parallels in Psalm 61 and Psalm 27, that the opening image of dwelling in God's tent refers to living under God's care and receiving his provision and protection. This is supported by the promise at the end of the psalm, which is the negative counterpart to the positive images in verse 1. The one who does these things will never be shaken. That is to say, the one who does these things will live securely in God's care. This interpretation is consistent with the meaning of the verb translated here as dwell, Hebrew gur, which is translated elsewhere as sojourn. According to the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, this verb refers to a state in which humans live in a place which is not their place of origin or nationality. And because they live in a foreign place where they did not have strong connections, sojourners were especially vulnerable and especially dependent on their neighbors for provision and protection in times of need. For a sojourner to sojourn in someone's tent, then, is to experience their hospitality, to live under their care and receive their provision and protection. In the B line of verse 1, this image is taken up to another level. Whereas the A line talks about sojourning in the Lord's tent, the B line talks about dwelling on his holy mountain. God's holy mountain is a reference to Mount Zion. And just as a guest lived under the care of his host, those who lived in Zion lived under the care and protection of Zion's God. If this interpretation of verse 1 is correct, then Psalm 15 is not about the kind of person who's privileged to worship in the temple, but about the kind of person who is privileged to live under God's care, like a guest in the house of a good host, or a resident in the city of the great king. We give this interpretation a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The last issue, the meaning of verse 1, is especially important because it sets up the whole psalm as the question to which the rest of the psalm gives an answer. If we read verse 1 as talking about temple worship, then the rest of the psalm describes the kind of person who's fit to worship in the temple. But if verse 1 is interpreted as we have read it, then the rest of the psalm is about the kind of person who's privileged to live under God's care and to experience the blessings promised to God's people. This person is described in 10 lines, perhaps reminiscent of the 10 Commandments Israel received on Mount Sinai. The 5th line describes this person as someone who has not uttered a taunt against his relative. That is, he's not said anything that would wrongfully bring shame on the people around him. The 8th line describes this person as someone with integrity, someone who keeps their promises even when it's to their personal disadvantage. Having sworn so as to harm himself, he will not change. This is the kind of person who will experience the Lord's provision and protection. As the end of the psalm says, the person who does these things will never be shaken. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 15, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of this psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our Poetic Features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.